Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third day of the Associated Church Press Religion Communications Council and Canadian Christian Communicators Association Conference. Opening new portals is our theme, and I'm pleased today to have the opening plenary session with us. It is the Global Media Monitoring Project, which monitors the role of women in media around the world. But first, I want to get to a couple announcements. If you were around yesterday, you can go see the Canadian Christian Communicators Association awards presentation. I was there for that. Congratulations to everyone. The RCC Awards, the DeRose Hinkhouse Awards, has been moved to tomorrow night at 5 p.m. And then the Wilbur Awards are at 7 p.m. Eastern. So again, that's a change in that. For those ACP members, today is our annual member meeting at 4:30 p.m. Eastern, and then our awards ceremony will begin at 7 p.m. Eastern. And if you're on the schedule, and please, anyone can feel free to attend, especially the awards ceremony, and it's a lot of fun to see what our other organizations are doing and how their members have what their members have produced over the year and what has been awarded. With that, I want to begin a brief share of our information. Again, the conference is presented by the Associated Church Press, the Canadian Christian Communicators Association, and the Religion Communicators Council. And we are sponsored this year. Our title sponsor was Fetzer. They did our opening plenary yesterday. That presentation is up for review if you want to go see that. Fetzer Institute is our title sponsor. Our gold sponsors are the American Baptist Home Mission Societies, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and Shanley Associates. Silver sponsor is the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Our bronze sponsors are Mennonite Disaster Service, Sokagaki International, and Worship Times. Our community sponsors are the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, Polaris Nonprofit Solutions, and our in-kind sponsors are Broadview Magazine, Janice Eck, who did our graphics, and the Christian Recorder. They all did promotional work for us. So with that, I'm here to introduce Susan Jackson Dowd. She is the president of Presbyterian Women, and she is going to make introduction of the Global Media Monitoring Project and of the panelists. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Greg, and hello, everyone. Welcome to the Global Media Monitoring Project, or GMMP, panel discussion, a program of the World Association of Christian Communication. The Global Media Monitoring Project has worked for 25 years to understand gender differences in portrayal, representation, and voices of women and men in the mainstream news media. As Greg said, I am Susan Jackson Dowd, and so pleased to be with you this morning. I'm joining you from Louisville, Kentucky, which is home of the Kentucky Derby and the Presbyterian Church USA headquarters. I serve as the executive director for Presbyterian Women, Inc., and which is the women's organization of the Presbyterian Church USA. And I'm currently serving on the executive committee of the World Association for Christian Communication, North America. Our panelists today are Philip Lee. Maybe Philip will give a little wave. Joining us from London, Philip serves as General Secretary of the World Association for Christian Communication and editor of the International Journal Media Development. We also have Sarah Macaria joining from Nairobi. She's the manager for gender and communication with the World Association for Christian Communication and the lead editor of the 2010 and 2015 editions of Who Makes the News. We have also Gloria Dharmaraj. She's live from New York. She's president of the World Association for Christian Communication for North America, also known as WAC-NA. She's been involved in coordinating the Global Media Monitoring Project since its inception in 1995. And we also have Veronica Silva Cusi joining from Toronto. Veronica is a multimedia journalist and researcher, editor, videographer, and photographer. She's the coordinator for Canada for the Global Media Monitoring Project 2020. Our format today is that our panel members will provide some background information and then we'll move into a discussion. If you have questions along the way, please write them in the chat box. We will take these up in the last 20 to 30 minutes. We'll also take some live questions from you at that time. So let's start with our introduction to communication rights and the GMMP. To get started, Philip and Sarah, will you introduce briefly the concept of communication rights and the context of the GMMP?
Thank you, Susan. I'm delighted to be part of this panel. The background to communication rights really goes as far back as the 1970s, when we were talking about the New World Information and Communication Order, NWICO. This was also against the background of political ferment in many countries, and I guess the rise of feminist politics at the same time. So we moved from the 70s into the 1980s, when a very famous report in the field of communication rights was published, called the McBride Report. It was brought about by UNESCO, and it focused really on news flows at the time and the disparities between North and South. In a sense, the whole debate around NWICO and then the McBride Report led to the communication rights in the Information Society campaign, CRIS campaign it was called, and it was asking, you know, who owns the means of communication? How are people's rights affected by ownership and control issues, and a lot of other stuff that gets involved in that as well, and very particularly between, as I say, countries in the global north and the global south. This led almost directly to the ITU World Summit on the Information Society. It took place in 2003 and 2005, in which probably for the first time, civil society organizations were invited to give their views on the whole panoply of media reform issues around the world. This led to media reform in several countries, notably the United States of America. Issues around internet neutrality when the internet came forth, and then ultimately, I guess, digital justice and inclusion in today's world. Now, that's a rather brief, focused snapshot of the situation, but that's the context in which the GMMP is situated, and Sarah will explain a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Philip. Indeed, it is an honor to be taking part in the RCC yet again. This, I think, is probably maybe the fourth time that we're talking about the GMMP. Well, the GMMP is a research and advocacy initiative for gender equality in and through the news media. It brings into focus concerns about gender disparities in participation in the mainstream news, about inequalities in freedom of expression, and the extent to which the news media worldwide are faithful to basic ethics and standards agreed within the industry. Fair and balanced portrayal of all people, representation without sexist stereotypes matter, and they are a hallmark of professional journalistic practice. The GMMP is a brainchild of participants at a conference in Bangkok just more than 25 years ago in 1994. This was a conference that was convened by the World Association for Christian Communication in collaboration with two international feminist communication networks, one based in New York, the other one based in Manila, Philippines. The participants agreed to organize one day at the start of 1995 to monitor the media and to use the data as a basis for analysis of where women were in terms of their presence, their portrayal and representation in the news. The first monitoring took place in 1995 and once every 5 years thereafter. The sixth edition of the research, we just concluded it in 2020 and are now working on the data analysis. Since 1995, we have applied the participatory media monitoring methodology to build the data on gender in the news media. And by the media, I mean print, television, radio newscast, and more recently, including news websites and news media tweets. The GMMP translates into action recommendations made in key international blueprints for gender equality policy, notably what is called the Beijing platform for action for the advancement of women. This was adopted at the 4th UN World Conference on Women in 1995. And this is an instrument that calls for two things. One, to increase the participation and access of women to expression and decision making in and through the media and new technologies of communication. And secondly, to promote a balanced and non-stereotype portrayal of women in the media. One of the GMMP's objectives as a longitudinal or a time series study is to compare change over time. And the results are published in the series Who Makes the News, and the 6th edition will be launched by June this year. The initiative is implemented by a global network of civil society actors, media professional organizations, students, and researchers in more than 100 countries, led by country coordinators. And in this session, we have the coordinator for the US, who's been doing this since 1995, and the coordinator for Canada, who joined us in 2020. For the most recent edition, we had teams in countries that were taking part for the very first time, such as Greenland and Myanmar. Many countries that have been part of it since 1995, including the US and Canada, and countries returning after a long absence, such as Russia. The country teams are provided with a methodology guide that details the sampling methodology, the number of media to code, the guidelines on which news bulletins and programs to select, and contextual information for each country. These are practical instructions on how to code for each type of media. And we collect up to 25 pieces of information about each news story, from the information about the story to information about the people in the story, who are the subjects or sources in the story, as well as the journalists presenting or reporting the story. Susan.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Philip. The next questions are about findings from the research to date. I'll start with the global first. So Sarah, you're on again. In the last 25 years, what findings have been most surprising or significant?
Well, as we are all aware, 2020 was no ordinary year, and it certainly wasn't one for the news media. The news were replete with stories about the pandemic, the numbers of those infected, those who had passed away, stories of loss of life and loss of livelihoods. But by the Global Monitoring Day in September, we had planned to have it in April, but due to the pandemic intensifying at that time, we postponed it to September later in the year. So by the Global Monitoring Day, the pandemic stories were tapering off, and in fact, only a quarter of the total sample were related to COVID-19. Now, this is important because it allowed us, this including a tweak that we integrated into the data collection tool, allowing us to classify pandemic stories under a secondary topic such as politics and economy. All this together made it possible for us to do the usual cross-year comparisons. So the first startling finding, the past 5 years have seen small incremental changes towards parity in subjects and sources, particularly in broadcast news. At the same time, the pace of change remains glacial. Between 1995 to 2020, the largest strides towards parity in subjects and sources, these are the people who are heard, seen, read about, tweeted about in the news. The largest strides have been made in radio news, and the smallest change has been news and radio newscasts tie in terms of the proportion of the stories seen, heard, spoken, or read about who are women. We find that in the past 5 years, television has traded places with newspapers as the medium in which women appear most in terms of legacy media. Other statistics tell us that TV viewership numbers shot up to unprecedented levels during COVID, that in 2020, and likely because there was a frantic search for any and all information about the pandemic. What is startling about the GMMP numbers overall in the period since 1995 is just how slow the pace of change towards parity has remained. And considering that women are half the population and the numbers of those participating in the public space have increased considerably, it is clear that the news media still have a long way to go to reflect reality. The second startling finding, actually, this is an illustration from the sample of stories related to COVID-19. Those women and men who appear most as experts in COVID-19 televised news are health specialists. From the chart in the next slide. But only 1 out of 3 is a woman. The gender composition of experts in the news is partly a reflection of the physical world in which women make up the majority of health sector workers, but they are underrepresented in high-skilled jobs. But this disparity between, the media picture and the reality is that it is also partly a reflection of media gender bias, given the gap between the sex ratio of health specialists in reality and the same as expert witnesses. And the final finding that I would like to highlight is this. One would expect professional journalism with a COVID-19 theme to be more careful about integrating a gender lens, considering the now very common knowledge that gender inequalities have become more pronounced as a result of the pandemic. Surprisingly, non-COVID-19 stories are more likely to challenge gender stereotypes than stories related to the pandemic. In fact, for example, on Twitter, 3% of tweets not related to COVID-19 are likely to challenge gender stereotypes, but this probability falls in tweets related to the pandemic.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Glory, will you share with us about the US context?
Thanks, Susan. Honored and delighted to be here. A survey of the findings in the US since 1995 shows some increase in the presence of women as news subjects. Women as news subjects in the traditional media. Here you see the leftmost cluster of columns represents women as news subjects. There is a significant change in women as news subjects since 1995, when we had only 28% of women as sources. The years 2000 to 2010 was a period of decline and stagnation for women as news subjects, from 23% to 27%. There was quite an increase in 2015 when women subjects constituted 38% of news stories. But in the most recent one, it stands at 34%. This is a snapshot of women as subjects in print, radio, and TV news stories in the last quarter of a century. Interestingly enough, in internet and Twitter in the year 2015, when Twitter monitoring was introduced for the first time, the presence of women was significantly high at 40%, as we see in the second cluster of columns from the left. In 2020, it stands at 32%. Gender parity seems elusive still. The middle cluster of columns shows women interviewed as experts. There is a significant stride in the last 15 years for women as experts in news stories, 22% to 41%. In women interviewed as spokespersons, the cluster of columns second from the right, there is a drop from 2015 findings, where women were 38% as spokespersons interviewed. In 2005, 21%, 2010, 26%, 2015, 38%, and 2020, 26%. In the rightmost cluster, we see print news stories reported by women. In spite of the decline of newspaper industry in the recent years, print news stories reported by women in 2020 was 43%, a steady increase in the last quarter of a century, 38% in 1995 to 43% in the recent one, with a decrease in 2010 to to 31%. This growth towards gender parity in print news is a noticeable one. Back to you, Susan.
Thank you, Lori, for that. And Veronica, welcome to the conversation. Will you tell us about Canada?
Hi, Susan. Certainly, yeah. Thanks for this opportunity to report about what's happening in Canada over the last few years, last 25 years. So if you will notice in the slides, the slide will show up in a little while. If you will notice, over the 25 years that we've been doing this study, for the 2020 study, it's showing there that over time, women have become more visible in the news, whether we're talking about traditional media or digital media. So when you talk about traditional media, we're referring to traditional print, radio, and TV. And for digital media, we refer to them as the internet and Twitter news. So if you will notice, women's visibility has been increasing over the years, particularly if we're going to talk about 2015 and the 2020 study. Women have, and this is with regards to women as subjects and sources of the news. If you will refer to the next, third, and fourth set of bars, you will notice that women's presence in the news as people interviewed as expert for their expert opinion has increased dramatically in the past 5 years, and has also increased with regard to their voice as spokespersons. And spokespersons, these are the people who are speaking in behalf of a group. So you will notice there, like for instance, as experts of news, that's a big jump from 18% to 35% from 2015 to 2020. And that's the same thing for women be interviewed as spokespersons from 21% to 30%. 21% in 2015 to 30% in 2020. For the last set of bars, you will notice that when it comes to who reports the news, if you will notice there, stories by women are fewer now compared to 2010 and 25 monitoring. So it's only 37% for the 2020 study versus 42% and 43% for 2015 and 2010. It's unlike in the US where, as Glory mentioned, bylines of women have been increasing over the years.
Many thanks to the three of you for this really helpful data. Glory, how did women fare as journalists and news subjects during COVID crisis coverage in comparison to men?
Thanks, Susan. Globally, women appear as experts. We can see it in the next slide. Women appear as experts at 22% in news stories in topics relating to politics and government, the leftmost cluster, third column. In the US, the percentage is 33%, blue column. In Canada, women are 17%. In economy, women experts are 40% in news stories in Canada, 19% in the US, and 24% globally. In the news stories covering science and health, women experts are 18% in the US, compared to 26% globally, and 41% in Canada. In the US, it's a significant drop from 2015, when women were 56% experts in science and health in the traditional media. The topic covered last time in 2015 was the high-profile strike against ovarian cancer, where Angelina Jolie dealt with the sensitive issue in her personal life and shared it in public. In the COVID-related coverage in 2020, women as experts have not fared well in news stories, even though the impact of COVID on women has been severe. And as Sarah has pointed out, women as health workers have been adversely impacted, but there are many in number. In the area of social and legal, last cluster of columns, which includes family relations, education, childcare, women's movements, legal system, migration, and refugees. Globally, women make up 55% of experts in news stories. In Canada, it is 60%, and the US, 58%. It is curious that in the social and legal category, women as subjects appear as sharing personal experiences at 100%. This is curious, a point to reflect on. Women as sharers of personal experiences. So this is a deeper gender analysis to look at. As for journalists overall, 40% of women reported COVID-related stories in the US. 53% of women reporters in politics and government-related stories. 48% of women reported in stories of economy. In science and health, female reporters make 33%. In social and legal stories, women make up 36% of reporters. Celebrity stories by women reporters are 75%. Gender parity is yet to be achieved in reporting hardcore subjects. Back to you, Susan.
Thank you, Glory, for sharing those statistics. Interesting, the whole storytelling component and the gender role in that. Veronica, you're up next again with a two-part question. Are there significant differences between traditional and digital news media in the coverage of women as news subjects and sources? And the second question, are there significant gender differences between traditional and digital media in the journalists who cover the stories?
Thank you, Susan, for those questions. So I'm going to talk to you about preliminary global GMMP data. We released the preliminary report in March, and according to the preliminary results based on 2/3 of the sample, since the GMMP started to monitor digital news in 2015, women's visibility as subjects and sources has increased by a couple of points. When it comes to COVID news treatment on the internet, women are less visible in stories related to COVID-19 than in non-COVID-19 news, especially, and this is especially true in Latin America and Asia. That's for the first question. Now, for the second question, since these are preliminary results, one of the significant progress in news storytelling that was noted in the preliminary report was that there are more women reporting the news on TV compared to men. And when I say more women, that they're at 48% compared to men. In Canada, and this is where I'm going to share country statistics. In Canada, there are more women announcers or presenters or reporters, or you call them sometimes anchors, on TV, and they number 69% rather compared to men. Only 37% of journalists in print are women, and only 33% of women journalists are in radio. For digital media, what we call the internet and Twitter news, there are more male reporters for internet news at slightly more at 51% compared to Twitter news. For Twitter news, it's a 50-50 share.
Okay, thank you, Veronica, for that. Finally, Glory, how does the GMMP capture other factors that contribute to marginalization, such as race, immigration status, and indigenous identity?
Sorry, there has been some internet problems. This is a question on marginalization, race, immigration. For the first time in the media monitoring questionnaire, a provision was made to include 3 special questions. On the US side, the monitoring form included, is the person's race or ethnicity mentioned in the text or visible in the images? Is the person in the text living with disability or made visible in the images? Yes or no? Is the person's sexual orientation or immigrant or migrant status mentioned in the text? Yes or no? The monitors added more specifics under comments. The rationale was to deepen an understanding of how race, class, gender, sexual identity, disability, migrant and immigrant status intersect gender as a general category. Even during ordinary times, laws notwithstanding, inequalities due to gender, age, race, ethnicity, disability, sexuality, and other social markers exist. We did not anticipate COVID when we added these questions. COVID has exposed some of the entrenched inequities already existing in the US, such as access to resources, healthcare, social services. Kimberly Crenshaw, an African-American legal scholar, has named these intersectional vulnerabilities. In the US, race or ethnicity mentioned in the news stories is 22%, of which 4 out of 10 are women. A key story covered was Breonna Taylor and the process undertaken by the prosecutor with a jury. And another is the story of Misty Copeland, being the first African American to become the principal dancer in the American Ballet. Persons living with disability referred to in the text or visible in the images is 1%. 6 out of 10 are women. Sexual orientation or immigrant status or migrant status mentioned is 3%, and 3 out of 10 are women. In Latin America, indigenous peoples constitute only 1% of news subjects. Only 3 out of 10 are women. Intersectionality matters in restoring the voices of those who are impacted in order to specifically address the systemic inequities already existing in the communities based on the intersections of gender, race, class, age, and differently abled bodies. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Glory, and thanks to all for providing the GMMP background. It's time for us to move on to discussion. We'll start with Glory and Philip. How is the GMMP relevant to faith communicators and to faith communities?
Human flourishing is at the heart of the religions. Protecting and promoting human dignity and flourishing are the core of our belief systems. Our histories also show that systems of power and privilege often marginalize women, girls, and sexual minorities. Religion and culture play an important role in gender justice issues. In the lived realities and contexts of women and girls, often narrow interpretations of religious texts threaten the rightful place of the vulnerable members in societies. Women's bodies could be made a contested space by competing interpretations of religious texts. There has been a growing tendency to use religion for political gains by politicizing religion. At the same time, we, faith communicators, have the capacity and power to create reflective spaces for healing and wholeness as well as analytical spaces. Analytical spaces to name and address the root causes of systemic inequities and address them. If the voices of those adversely affected by systems are heard in the religious news coverage and their issues named, and the patterns of systemic inequities revealed, and the vulnerable themselves are identified as agents of change, offering solutions, the rest of us can work together for the collective well-being of our communities. The face of poverty is still female. The face of victims of domestic violence and face of caregiving is female. During the pandemic, the face of the essential worker taking care of the children at home, as well as their studies, is female. As faith communicators and bearers, we are in the long tradition of engaging in goods and services, as well as interrupting and addressing systemic social ills. Thank you.
Thank you, Glory. That's a far more comprehensive answer than I'm going to give to a potentially difficult question. I think this is very easy for us to look outwards and to criticize secular media and major media houses and everything. And it's always incumbent on us, I think, to look inwards as well and to ask the very searching question, are we doing the same? Can we do better? Where are the problems in our own communication output? So I think that's one issue. Another is clearly the whole business is to do with justice. And people of faith talk about justice in different kinds of ways. Glory's outlined some of them. Poverty is one issue, for example. But gender sensitivity, gender justice is also another major issue, not just of our times, but a long-standing one, given patriarchy in society. And I think, as was the case with HIV and AIDS, and as is the case with COVID-19 and the uptake, for example, of vaccines and so on, it comes back to behavioral change. If faith leaders and others can't advocate for justice issues in terms of behavioral change, then in one sense, what are we doing? So it's very important that faith communicators pick up the findings of the GMMP and try and figure out how they can contribute positively to greater change. Thank you.
Many thanks, Glory and Philip, for your responses. Sarah, we're going to move back to you with a question. In the last 25 years, how has the GMMP contributed to advancing gender equality in and through the media?
Thank you, Susan. The GMMP has made an important mark, especially at the policy level, international policy level. The GMMP as a process, the GMMP as hard data that crystallizes discrimination against women in the news media into hard statistics. So at the international level, for example, in the conclusion statements that are adopted each year at the Commission on the Status of Women sessions, the Commission on the Status of Women meets every year to discuss progress in implementing policy, a global level policy on gender equality and women's rights. At the national level, the GMMP findings have made a mark in influencing communication policies, as well as policies that are specific to gender equality and to the prevention of violence against women. And at the media house level, the GMMP findings have been used to enhance internal policies and reporting guidelines with a gender lens in view of the findings. GMMP results have also been used extensively for media education, for example, for training in media houses and by media development organizations. So that is to increase the capacity of media professionals to report and to understand their output from a gender perspective. In terms of GMMP as a process, monitoring groups report that taking part in the GMMP is a process of awareness raising. Promoting media literacy and gender awareness through media monitoring is an important aim of the GMMP. Nevertheless, its overriding goal is to change media output. Groups across the world have been able to use the GMMP results to launch dialogue. And this is constructive dialogue, productive dialogue with media practitioners and policymakers. The data have proven invaluable in opening up conversations about accepted routines and practices in media production that result in specific patterns of gender imbalance, and about how alternative choices and approaches could lead to a fairer, more balanced gender portrayal. We have learned that gender balance in journalism allows media audiences to see the whole picture. The stories of women need to be told as well, and all stories need to be told from the perspectives of all those who are affected or implicated, including women and all groups that make up the society. As a tool for change, the strength of the GMMP lies in the hard data which reach media professionals with an immediacy that is never achieved by theory or abstract argument. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Sarah. Our last group of questions is for you again and for Philip. There are 3 questions here, and they're all basically giving us some general information about what to look for next. So they are, what are you planning to do with the information when the final results come out? The second question, where and when are the final results going to be published? And how can audiences access these results?
Yes, well, the final report will be published on the website whomakesthenews.org in June, and the database will be open source. It will be available to researchers, policymakers, and anyone wishing to interrogate the data further. All this information will be available on whomakesthenews.org, which is the website of WACC that is devoted to gender and communication. The report will contain a special focus on the roles of indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, racialized groups, and the elderly in stories published on the Global Monitoring Day. This is new for GMMP 2020 because, as Glory mentioned, for the first time we were able to add specific questions, special questions in each country that were important to contextualize the results to the country, as well as to capture data that cannot be captured at the global level. So the report will also contain a special focus on the representation of social justice movements through a case study of the GMMP Day snapshot of news related to Black Lives Matter. This was a special question that was asked in the UK leg of the research. And the report will also contain the gender analysis of change in the specific roles of news journalists across the quarter century since 1995. We plan to make projections for progress over the next decade and beyond. We plan to demonstrate through analysis the links between persistent gender inequality and marginalization of already marginalized voices on the one hand, and the lived social, economic, and political experience. And finally, we plan to offer recommendations for the media industry, for media professionals, for governments, for media development organizations, for civil society, the research community, and basically all stakeholders vested in gender equality in and through the media.
It's very easy, I think, to imagine that once a piece of research has been concluded, you publish a report and it goes on the shelf. You know, it's got to be taken down off the shelf. You've got to pick up again where people had left off, I think, and implement the recommendations to do an immense amount of grassroots work as follow-up. And this is what WAC and the GMMP will be doing with partners in 140 odd countries worldwide, because this is not an ending, but a beginning. Each GMMP report has that function. So we have the data, the results and so on, but now need to run with them and see how to bring about further change as we can. I think that's one thing. And then, as Sarah has mentioned, we're about constructive dialogue, but we're also in a rapidly changing, largely unregulated media environment, where legacy media have been challenged, and we're now faced with unregulated digital platforms. And that constructive dialogue is all the more difficult when you can't do it with editors and media houses. You have to do it with an amorphous body of communication that's taking place in hundreds of different languages and hundreds of different contexts worldwide. So I think this is a major challenge that we shall have to be looking at on the basis of the results of GMMP 2020, but also in the context, that larger context that I mentioned at the beginning of communication rights.
Wonderful, thank you both. We have arrived at the audience's opportunity to interact with the panel. So we'll ask the question, what questions do you have for Glory, Philip, and Sarah? And we'll address as many questions as we can. I'm looking for questions in the chat, but I don't see any for the moment. So please do feel free to interact with the panel.
Susan, I have one question I'd like to ask the panel. And, you know, obviously this is a research program about the media. What are some strategies maybe that our people who work in media, journalists or communicators, can use to best represent this data, to use this data in their work? How can this data give them not only just, you know, charts and figures, but real ways to contact people to elevate this issue and to maybe work towards including more women in the voices of media?
Yes, I can take that question. Over the years, the GMMP has produced tools for media professionals, for media practitioners, to make it possible to understand output from a gender perspective. We have on our website, whomakesthenews.org, we have a gender in journalism compass. That's one that helps a communicator or journalist to interrogate their reporting from a gender perspective. We have also a toolkit on journalism, gender ethical journalism, that is understanding journalism ethics of accuracy, balance, fairness, and all the basic tenets of professional journalism from a gender perspective. So all those tools are available. The GMMP provides those. And on top of that, we also provide infographics that make it easier to understand the patterns and trends over the years, and to see, to sort of project where we can be or where we're going to be if we continue at that rate, where we're going to be for the next 50 years or so. And unfortunately, we have to project up to even 60 years in order to reach parity. So, I mean, it's a long road ahead, but the GMMP does all it can to provide this, as well as our partners who are all volunteers in the more than 100 countries around the world that also take this data and run with it and use it for training and use it for all kinds of actions that are intended to bring about change.
Thank you, Sarah. Would anyone else like to respond to Greg's question? If not, we are having some questions in the chat. Amy Renshaw asks, what aspect of the findings do you think is most surprising or compelling? Who would like to respond?
Let me take this. In my findings, women as survivors, in spite of what has been going on. That statistics may be smaller, but it is well documented, 13%. And victims of discrimination based on gender, race, ethnicity, religion, ability, 23%. They did not come out as mere victims. They have come out as survivors. Though the statistics are not as much as we would like to, it is somewhere we can start with for mobilizing a social movement. It is a grassroots tool, as it has been pointed out earlier. And that is something. And also, as it has been pointed out earlier, the print news media and how reporters have tenaciously engaged in that. That is something. And for policy changes, it may be useful because in 2010, we took some of these results and we were mobilizing volunteer women to make a change in the US policy. At that time, we had Healthy Media for Youth Act, HR 4925. Some of you may remember that. And we were mobilizing volunteers using these grassroots findings. So what is compelling is we have some of these results and we have the opportunity to steer forward with this instrument.
Thank you, Lori. We have another question from Amy and a question from Virginia Hostetler. Let me ask you that one first to the panel. As you have mentioned the trends, can you speak about the impact on consumers of media? Have you seen changes in society as women's presence has increased? Who would like to respond, or several of you?
Yes, I can begin. The GMMP, given that we monitor what we see, what we observe, what we read, what we hear about in the news media, and not necessarily audience research, we can't tell from the GMMP. However, there are other studies out there that get to this question. And what has become apparent is that there has been an increasing trend towards women creating their own media outside the mainstream media in ways that they then have the space where they can reflect their own voices. There seems to be more, women moving away from the mainstream and going to the margins, which is not really the answer. The answer should be about democratizing media, making this a space that is accessible to all. So that would be the answer to that question. In terms of changes in society, as women's presence has increased, really, really very slowly. We had a stagnation between 2015 and 2010. We were stuck at 24% of voices and faces in the news media, women as voices and subjects and sources in the news. And we are edging upwards a little, and the results will be released later in June. But really, the change has been really, really glacial. And on some indicators, there has been, for example, an indicator of who reports the news. Who do we see reporting? Who do we see in the bylines? And for the longest time, between 2005 and 2015, for a good 10 years, women were reporting only 37% of the stories in legacy media. That's television, radio, and print news combined. for the first time, we have seen, we predicted that seemed to be a global glass ceiling for women in terms of their visibility as reporters in the news. But now it seems like that glass ceiling is edging upwards. But in terms of presence, the change has been really glacial, very, very slow.
And I think to the first point, if I might just add something, for as long as traditional and legacy media existed, as it were, it was extremely difficult, extremely expensive for women to say, let's start a newspaper, let's start a television channel. The only exception might have been community radio, but in many countries that would have been subject to licensing by the government and that kind of thing. But now, with digital platforms, the positive side may be, that it's far easier for women to set their own channel of communication up that looks at things differently from the existing media. I think that's something we should bear in mind anyway.
Thank you, Sarah, and all important points. I will go back to another question from Amy Renshaw. Have you studied how girls, kids and youth, children and youth appear in the media? What is the impact of women's lack of representation on youth today? Who would like to respond?
Okay, so I can respond to this one as well, since I have been with the GMMP for a while. We have not particularly looked at girls, although it is possible to drill down the data, since we do categorize those who appear in the media according to age. And for the first time in this monitoring, we included a new age bracket, which was 80 and up. Before that, we had 79 and I think 69 and up. But in terms of the impact on lack of representation on youth, women's lack of representation on youth, something that is often said is that you cannot be what you cannot see. So lack of representation or bad, sexist portrayal, or for example, of women in leadership or women in politics, that deters, because we understand that media are a source of culture. And youth, young people, children are socialized. It's a big agent of socialization. So the theory says that without when there is lack, when there is unfair representation, when there is stereotypical representation, then that also influences how young people see themselves, what they aspire to be, where they aspire to go. So just in line with the theory, fairer portrayal, better representation, more accurate portrayal, in more empowering roles would have an impact on how, for example, girls see themselves, and also how both boys and girls understand gender relations as they grow up in society.
And on the US side, I have some stats, just preliminary stats. In the 2020 monitoring, in 4 stories, youth appear, ages between 13 and 18. And that is 100% in that group, just 4 stories. And 19 to 35 years of age, 59%. 35 to 49 years, 52%. 50 to 60 years, 14%. 65 upward, 21%. So this is again some clue from print media. There is some presence of youth, but not much.
Thank you, Gloria. And Sarah. Anyone else like to respond to the question? We don't have additional questions in the chat, so I would invite other questions if you would like to enter them into the chat, or I would also invite the panelists to provide any additional comments that you would like to provide for the audience at this time. We have a little bit of time remaining.
Well, gender analysis is a very tricky thing, and just seeing women's presence in the media may not communicate anything significant from the point of view of change, transformation, until their perspectives are included. And another angle I noticed in the story we covered on the US side, that was the day when Judge Amy Barrett, now Justice Amy Barrett, was nominated, and her pictures were all over. In one of the stories, she was covered, and the interviewees were religiously conservative women. It is a personal story as well as partisan political appeal story. But there's a gender-specific angle that has intrigued me. Because when she was presented as the ideal of womanhood, depicted as one with a large family, in this case, 7 children, 2 among them adopted, with a highly professional achievement in law. If it were a male nominee, the number of children or the combination of a large family and professional achievement would not be a gender indicator for success. Usually the question posed is whether he would stand for Planned Parenthood or pro-life when it comes to taking a legal stance. So while the justice has shattered the myth of biology is destiny, for the journalist, a gender-just metrics may have delivered a more nuanced idea of gender. The narrative leaves out categories that intersect with gender, such as healthcare, medical access, education, childcare, economic security. All the people interviewed had access to higher education, seen through the prism of religion, reproduction, and profession. To me, that is very intriguing, that men and women would be judged by different gender metrics.
Thank you, Gloria. I think that always the different metrics that gender is are measured by. We've had another question come in from Or Spragan, and do forgive me if I've mispronounced your name, or is the editor of the Christian Index. Have opportunities for women to own media outlets increased over the time period covered? So owning media.
Well, media, as Philip had mentioned, it's very expensive to set up media houses, apart from if a group is setting up community media, mostly community radio or community newspapers. We have seen a shrinking of resources for this kind of work, for these kinds of initiatives. In fact, when we looked at data, especially in the global south, a lot of these initiatives would have to be funded by funding agencies. Looking at OECD data, this is data on grants to global south countries. Actually, the amount of funding that has gone towards women's communication work, and especially media, print, radio, has actually shrunk considerably over time. And in fact, this has been misplaced, especially communication is not really high up on the ladder of donor priorities. So we've seen a shrinking of those kinds of resources, especially for women. And, media conglomerations have actually grown considerably over the time. We are seeing a lot more of, the owners of media, they own the same media outlets, and women are actually really at the margins of these processes. So I would say that actually it's been much more difficult, and we can't say that there's been a major increase in media outlets owned by women.
Thank you, Sarah. Would anyone like to add to that response?
I think I would just say that I take the question in media outlets where there aren't obvious obstructions apart from the financing. But if one looks in many countries of the global south, for example, and I'll give you one example, there's a woman journalist called Maria Ressa, who runs a digital platform called Rappler in the Philippines. Now, she is contesting many of the injustices under the current government in that country. She owns and operates Rappler, but she equally has to face total lack of funding to keep it going, and the oppression of the Philippine government for what she's doing. So I don't think there's a cut and dried answer. It does very much depend on the context, the media environment in a particular country, and other factors.
Thank you, Sarah and Philip. Are there other questions? We're getting some appreciation in the chat box for the work of the GMMP and those of you here on the panel.
I would like to make one further comment. Often when we talk about the GMMP, we usually get the question, do you consider other gender minorities, not simply women and men? And yes, we do. We code for that, and we have been coding for that since the project began in 1995. Unfortunately, less than 1% of those who are seen in the news as sources and subjects, and of those who are reporting or presenting the news are coded under this code. So those results really don't see the light of day because they're so minuscule. And that's not to say that they're not important. It's also about underrepresentation. But just a confirmation that yes, we do collect those statistics.
Thank you, Sarah. That's such an important addition to the research. Other comments? We're winding down on our time, but we have a little bit of time for another comment.
Perhaps I could just say that I think it would be wonderful if the GMMP and its findings were taken up in media literacy, media education courses around the world. I think, an earlier question about how this impacts very young people, we have to start there. I think if we wait until they're 25, 30 or whatever, and then point out some of these deficiencies, already we've lost ground in a sense. So the earlier that we can say, this is an issue, this is a problem, this is how it works, what can be done about it, the better.
Thank you, Philip. That's an important message to wind up on. I'm not seeing further questions. And unless there are more comments, I will bring our session to a close. Anything further? With that, I will say many thanks to you, Veronica, Glory, Sarah, and Philip for providing the GMMP panel today. And thank you to those who are behind the curtain, Greg particularly, who has been present to us and is making sure things run smoothly. Thank you, Greg. Many thanks to all of you who have attended today. We hope that the session has been useful to you and that you have some practical information for moving forward. Please be in touch with further comments, questions, or any other follow-up. And otherwise, do enjoy the rest of the convention. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And
Bye.
thank you, everybody. This is always a great session. We've had, obviously, GMMP is presented in past years, and this year is absolutely an important time to hear this information and to present it to our groups. So I'm very thankful for each of you, for Susan for moderating, for Sarah, for Veronica, for Philip, and for Glory for being with us today. Everybody at the convention, please do look at your conference schedule. It has updated. We have added a breakout session this afternoon between the 1 o'clock and the 3 o'clock session. So 2:15 to 2:45, there's a breakout session. And with that, everyone, enjoy your break, and we will see you in about 45 minutes. Thanks so much. Bye.